The manhwa begins with a lady trying to escape from a man who keeps calling out to her. She turns her head to find the man still chasing after her, demanding to know where she's going. If I stay with you, I will no longer live, she thinks. Few minutes ago, the man whispers into her ear that he can no longer hold himself back and says it's her fault her body is driving him crazy. This lady appears confused, but he urges that they make it quick as the ship to his kingdom will soon arrive and they do not have much time. However, Belita pushes him away and then asks his identity, but the man instead mumbles that it hurts and then asks if she changed her mind already. He looks up at her and tells her she can't back out now since they've already come too far. As he makes his way to her, he tells her she doesn't have to call him Prince when it's just them two and she can just address him as Emer. He grabs her hand as she mumbles about what he's talking about. He declares that she stops talking since he's now reached his limit. As he holds her, she struggles, asking him to let go, but it isn't until he leans forward for a kiss that she breaks free from his grip and makes a run for it. As she escapes, the last thing she can recall is being hit by a truck. She begins to get faint memories from a novel she read. That man is the second prince of the Roka Empire, while she the notorious Empress of TYRANT Empire from the novel, The Flower on the Battlefield. Belita is known as the adulterous Empress, so full of lust that not a day goes by that she isn't with a man. According to the novel, while eloping, Emer and Belita give in to their burning desire, which allows the Emperor to find them and chop off their heads. Now she is in that scene, and as she hurries she bumps into someone and falls to the ground, but her face goes pale as she realizes that the person with such a strong presence is her killer, Kalik the Tyrant. Save me, she murmurs, and as she looks at the prince she thinks, you go away, you're going to have us lived. Emer notices the Emperor and asks what he's doing there, but unfortunately a knight behind him lands a blow on his neck. As they gather around him, she begs the Emperor not to kill him yet. He tells her she seems to have forgotten his name already, and as she panics she quickly says, Kalik, thank you for saving me. Save you, he says, his voice sharp. She tells him she was running from the prince. Are you sure it wasn't me? The Emperor asks, and she suggests he takes a look at her. She calls his name, asking him to believe her. We are married. Am I not your wife? She asks. She doesn't notice the snake on the tree, so as the Emperor flings his sword she presses her eyes close. He asks her to raise her head, and when she turns she finds the sword in between the snake. He asks if she mentioned that she is his wife and then asks that she proves it. She panics and he steps closer and tells her to prove that she deserves to be the lady of the palace. Dazed, she asks how, and as he leans in he replies that he's asked her to prove it through the marital vow. Instantly she gets up and delivers a kiss on his cheek, but he doesn't appear pleased and his gaze is cold. He grabs her by her waist and kisses. However, they aren't able to do more than that as she passes out. The next day, she wakes up with her body hurting. She recalls the fierce kiss with the Emperor and wonders what happened afterwards and also why her Belita. Her nanny rushes in with a relieved expression. She fills the bathtub first, and as she takes her bath, her nanny explains that they'd used marigold instead of roses because they're better for injuries. As she relaxes in the water, she questions whether it is okay for her to be alive since following the original story, Belita and Emer were supposed to be lived the day before. The kingdom of Felon loses their only princess and the island kingdom of Roka, their second prince, so they join hands together to invade the empire. From there the true story begins. The tyrant loses his mind, caught up in both war and domestic rebellion, and ends up passing away, but unlike the original story, she and Emer were still very much alive. She then worries that Emer, who has no fear for the emperor, might reveal his affair with Belita. Just as she's thankful for being alive at least, she hears a knock on her door and a man who comes in and declares that he's ready. She's confused, but the man begins to slip his robe off, and she still remains very much confused when he doesn't stop. Finally, he drops his robe to the floor, and she shouts, attracting the attention of her nanny, who instantly rushes in. She turns to the man and demands what he's done to her, and he explains that he didn't do anything and hasn't even started yet, but that doesn't stop her from kicking him out. Her nanny goes to calm her down and after some time offers to take her to her bed. As she dries her hair, her nanny confirms if she's calm before suggesting she lies down, so they'll begin the massage. She agrees, and to her surprise, the men begin taking off their clothes. She covers her eyes as she asks why they're taking off their clothes again, but they only ask her if she's grown tired of them already. She explains that it's not like that and orders them to get out, and as she buries her head in her palm, she questions just how many men Belita has. Later at night, the Emperor lies next to his sword as he reflects on their arranged marriage from the beginning. Belita, who claimed to feel shackled to be with him and asked if her relation with other men was okay. In his memory, Belita has only constantly shown self-centered behavior relying on Felow's power, and the only reason he had remained tolerant was the agreement with Felon. He reflects on how he finally decided to put an end to everything, seeing how she had caused nothing but trouble, but her reaction was nothing like he expected. For a woman who played with more than half of the men in the palace, she blushed like a chaste lady, then she passed out while kissing, he thinks. He thinks he will wait to see how long her ridiculous play lasts, and if she was simply being fickle and returns to her old self soon, her fate would be decided, death. The Emperor calls out his knight and orders him to bring Belita to him as soon as she wakes up. At the same time, the nanny asks Belita if the boys had offended her in any way, worried because she used to seem so energized around boys. How about the boys I selected myself? The nanny asks, but she refuses, saying no more. Belita tells her nanny from that moment on she doesn't need any men. Her nanny, in shock by her sudden statement, tries to ask for an explanation when they hear a knock on the door. To their surprise, the man that walks in is the commander of the Imperial Knight himself. Her nanny goes to talk to him and later rushes to inform Belita that the Emperor has invited her to have lunch. Belita asks if she can refuse since she has a slight headache, but her nanny says of course not, and explains that it's the first time in 4 years since their marriage. Her nanny assures her that if it's the outfit that troubles her, she can count on her. I can elevate your beauty to the finest in this world. She arrives at the dining hall and can barely taste anything because of the awkward air around them. She stares at the Emperor, but once he glances back at her, she turns her head away. The Emperor begins speaking and says it seems she's become an entirely different person and asks if she's only putting on an act to avoid death. He tells her he did go to the woods the previous day to unalive her. She realizes that her fate of the previous day was only temporary and Kalik hasn't changed his mind about getting rid of her. She trembles at the thought of always having to be worried about death because of her past actions. Your Majesty, Kalik, I have decided to transform myself. She reveals, leaving the Emperor in shock. She tells him there will be no more men near her, and even that day she made all the male servants leave. The Emperor asks why, and she admits that she's realized her mistakes and she isn't just taking all those actions on a whim. 1 week, the Emperor says, you have 1 week. From tomorrow you shall come see me once a day, so I can determine whether your behavior befits that of an empress. In a new scene, Belita drops to her bed while her nanny questions, Your Majesty, what is all these? You say you don't need men and now you plan to behave. Belita mutters that she doesn't know the sword on her neck, and sensing her genuine concern for Belita, she decides to be honest with her. She confesses that she's lost her memories. Madame Carnal tells her she's there to teach her everything and she recalls it all so she can trust her. Later at night, Emer in the dungeon tries to bribe the guard there with a shiny piece of jewelry, explaining that it's not just a small piece as the price alone can buy a mansion. Suddenly a man walks in and announces to the guard that if he accepts it his head will be gone. The Emperor appears and Emer explains that he wasn't trying to escape, and instead he only meant to take a walk as his body aches from all the beating of the previous day. And yet you look quite well, Prince Emer, the Emperor adds. Emer comes forward asking how Belita is. The Emperor tells him as far as he knows she's still his wife, and he responds that he was planning to make her a real wife instead of a puppet in his kingdom of Roca. The Emperor then tells him he knows that would have ended his life, and he replies that he didn't know he would be so quick to find them given his indifference. To neglect Belita, the greatest lady I know, when you see her, any lover, no, man would feel their hearts pound and their body grow hot, Emer adds. He tells the Emperor he would never know that sensation, and as the Emperor meditates on it, their brief, intimate interaction lingers in his head. The Emperor tells him he isn't capable of communication, and as he turns away he tells the guard he looks warm and orders them to take off all his clothes, but the guard, worried, reminds the Emperor that he's foreign royalty. Exactly, I cannot take a prince's life. It could be quite interesting to run away naked, the Emperor says. The next day, Belita's has a gloomy look on her face as she recalls the Emperor's orders. She notices a butterfly, and when she looks outside, She asks her Madame Carnal what garden it is outside. She asks if she means the conservatory and suggests that they pay a visit since she'd lost her memories. Madame Carnal tells her she used to spend so much time there and she agrees to go. They pay a visit to the conservatory and she's amazed by the sight of the beautiful roses in disbelief that Belita had such a normal hobby. She soon notices a room and before her nanny can warn her, she pushes it open and her eyes widens as she spots the room's design. She wonders why a conservatory has a secret room, and as she wonders what to do with it, her nanny observes her thinking of how even with the memory loss she's changed a lot. That isn't how she reacts to things. She reflects on how she would slap her across the face and tell her she wouldn't have her life revolve around the Emperor, and especially not have her tell her what to do and then threaten to send her back to Felon. She thinks no matter what others say, her happiness has always been her priority. The memory loss has brought back your bright smile. Faced with confusion on what to do with the pink room, she tries to imagine Calic's reaction if he sees it and shudders at the thought of her being unalived as punishment. Madame Carnal comes to her and presents the budget for the Mr. Carton contest. She takes a closer look at the flyer and the nanny explains that it used to be her favorite event. The bath servants and masseurs she has kicked out are all from the contest. When she realizes that it's just an event to select Belita's men, she crumples the paper and calls out to Madame Carnal. I have no interest in a beauty contest like this and it will not happen. She also tells her to repaint the pink room as green and make it a place people can rest in the conservatory, and also she will be throwing out all the male servants from her palace. Her nanny worries and inquires whether she will hire replacements and explains that without the contest they do not have any candidates. Belita then clarified that she isn't saying she needs new boys, but starting from that moment the palace will not allow men inside except for official visits. This is an order, she finishes. In order not to give any excuse to Calic, I have to clean up all the mess created in the past. And survive, she thinks. Later, Belita goes to visit the Emperor in the Imperial Garden. They end up walking for 30 minutes around the garden before the Emperor turns to her and asks how long they are to walk. She asks if he would go back to his palace already and celebrates. The Emperor, determined to not give her what she wants, snaps his fingers and the maids appear and arrange some clothes on the ground. He sits and tells her his legs are sore due to the long walk and asks if she'll ease them. She asks if he wants her to do it right there, but he asks if it's too hard for her. Thinking it could be a qualification test, she tells the Emperor she's good at giving massages and immediately gets to work. As she focuses, she reflects on how the main story in the novel began with a war and concluded that the war is meant to happen. She thinks if she's able to run off to Felon before that without getting unalived by the Emperor, she will be able to survive, but his is the entire opposite. He fails to unify the kingdoms and his divine animal never comes. He loses his mind and dies a terrible death in war a week before turning 30, and even if he avoids death, his enemies in and out of the empire oust him. She questions whether he's surrounded by so many enemies because he's a tyrant. But he's called a tyrant not because he's a ruthless dictator, but because he is ruthless to his enemies, Belita thinks. Lost in thought, the Emperor calls her and she panics as she responds. He asks her why she keeps giving him those glances, and she says she was only checking to see if he liked the massage. He looks and tells her she's unusually obedient and her massage is also excellent. As if you've turned into a whole other person. She tells the Emperor she can always give him a massage and he asks why she would do it. As she wipes her sweat, she says because she's his wife. The Emperor grabs her hand, all of a sudden pulling her to him as he stares at her intensely. She looks for a while before asking if she's done something wrong, but he tells her he understands that she's his wife, but she should stop touching his inner thighs. She pulls away immediately and explains that it wasn't intentional, but as she panics, the flyer for the contest slips out of her pocket. The Emperor's expression changes as he spots it, thinking he knew she had an hidden agenda. He gets up, his expression cold and his voice chilly. Belita, not everything will go your way. He turns away and tells her he expects an improvement the next day. Calic's office an hour before the Bible Council. Calix hears his horse cry and he hurries thinking it's his white horse, but when he looks out the window, he spots a divine animal with a man in black hood, Curo Brunoir. The Emperor looks at him annoyed, questioning how he dares summon an incomplete creature knowing that he's in the Emperor's area. The Unified Cavalry Corps discuss how only those to whom a divine creature manifests itself before 30 can become the Emperor. Duke Jensen protests that divine creatures are a qualification to the throne and the emperor is yet to have one. Duke Santino adds that they were talking about a divine tiger that had appeared 2 years ago, but no one has seen anything like a tiger, not even a sick one. Duke Jensen mocks the emperor saying, "A tiger? I doubt he can get as much as a cat at this point." A man then adds that as for the former emperors, the divine creatures appeared naturally at the age of 25. A black wolf when the former emperor turned 25 and a giant bear for the emperor before that around the same time. He must be quite anxious as he nears 30. A man says, and they all panic as they spot the Grand Duke Kuro Brunoir. He urges them to continue talking since he quite enjoyed hearing it. The emperor's creature. Duke Santino explains that they had nothing else to talk about since there was no progress. Not even a small sign. He tells them he understands and then proceeds to take his seats. He summons his incomplete creature, and they all shower him with praises saying, although it's incomplete, it's truly magnificent. He suggests they proceed to the conference room and on their way, the other men discuss how the Baron who still remains loyal to the Emperor is an idiot. They snigger about the Emperor is about to be overthrown and they pity the Baron and his loyalty. It isn't until a man asks if the Baron shouldn't serve the real ones like them that the Grand Duke pauses and warns that there are ears around so he should mind his words. The man panics but the Grand Duke tells him he isn't the Emperor, at least not yet. They further discuss how the Emperor is yet to consummate his marriage and mock him saying even the most unchaste Empress refuses to be with him. The Grand Duke signals them to stop talking and soon, Belita comes out from the corner with Madame Carnal. Madame Carnal whispers that they are the unified cavalry corps led by Grand Duke Kuro Brunoir, and she reflects on how they're the villains of the original story. They are the rotten apples of the Empire who instigate war by summoning a divine horse. Her nanny tells her she must give a flat rejection to whatever they say, especially the Grand Duke as he's a dangerous man. The others greet her while the Grand Duke takes her hand and kisses it. She pulls away with disgust and the Grand Duke says, "That face, you look different." She begins to question whether Belita had something to do with the Grand Duke and thinks to calm down. She tells him she was only taken aback and asks why she would be different. He tells her he might be wrong but a lot seems to have changed, especially her aura, and her nanny hurriedly whispers, "Your Highness, flat rejection." "Yes, you are wrong. If that is all you have to say," she says before walking away. Later, as Belita enjoys her tea, Madame Carnal informs her that all has been done as she ordered and the room has been repainted and the Empress's palace now allows only women. She tells her the Emperor will be informed the next day. "One more thing, you know all the men I was intimate with, right?" Belita asks and she replies that no one knows better than her. She brings up the Grand Duke and asks if by chance they were together. Madame Carnal says no and Belita tells her she has to tell her immediately if she sees anyone who's had history with her. Her nanny, curious, asks what she's thinking and she replies that she should avoid them. Once again, her nanny tells her she seems to have become a completely different person over the past few days, and she replies that it's because she believes she should move on from being young and immature. At the council's meeting, the Grand Duke Dane Brunoir, the Emperor's closest aide, announces that the discussion for that meeting will be about the war with Uklo. A man tells the Emperor water supply is crucial in crossing the desert and then suggests they develop a special water pouch. The Emperor asks how and he explains that they'd have to continue with the research but he just frowned and said useless next. Another one suggests a cloak that allows them to secretly infiltrate into the enemies. Outrageous next, the Emperor replied. Another one suggested special shoes to help cross the desert but the Emperor still refused it. They discuss for a while before asking the Emperor if the war is really necessary since Uklo has never been conquered. Santino tells the Emperor he agrees and believes they should focus more on divine creatures than unification. They tell the Emperor they only have 6 months left and rather than a war, when a man yells that they should be careful what they say in front of the Emperor. They tell the Emperor they're only just concerned and ask if the unification would matter if the throne is at risk. Would it not be awfully bitter to pass the crown to the next? But before he can finish, the Emperor throws his sword at him and stops when it points at his eye. The Emperor tells them they seem to have forgotten who he is and asks if Duke Santino wasn't crying for death. The Emperor spots a person pulling out a sealed letter. He grins before swinging his sword and then goes to retrieve the letter from the man's body. "You're lucky, Duke Santino. Someone else died for you." The emperor says that he can't believe he didn't even try to conceal his attempts to pass the note and says perhaps it might be fun to start rooting out the rats in the palace. Duke Santino, who just narrowly escaped death, trembles as he thinks that even without a divine animal he is still the bloodthirsty tyrant, Kalik. At the same time in the Empress's palace, a maid, Lisa, rushes in to share the information that the emperor has cut off yet another head. She explains that the dead knight was supposedly a spy and even the conference room reeks of blood at the moment. She goes ahead to describe how his divine sword had gone through his neck as always and the blood had gushed out onto the floor, but the Empress orders her to stop. The maid asks if perhaps it wasn't fun, and she asks what is so fun about a person losing his life. The maid explains that she always enjoyed it whenever she shared news like that with her, reflecting on how she would always ask her to tell her more. The Empress tells her that wouldn't happen again, warning her to watch her mouth. She also tells her she's sure the emperor had his reasons, and the maid apologizes before leaving. As she walks, she wonders what is with the sudden change and whether she suddenly fears the emperor. She recalls how the other maids had discussed her changing and she cussing, thinking, "Belita, I will get rid of that mask." In a new scene, the Grand Duke orders his supporters to tell others to lie low. He asks about Duke Santino and they report that he'd passed out after the incident and is in such bad shape that he can't even get up. The Grand Duke recalls seeing a maid peeping into the bloodshed and wonders why she looks familiar. In a new scene, the maids bring tea to the Empress, who thanks them with a smile on her face. The maids all gush thinking of how she's truly changed and also gossip about Lisa being reprimanded by the Empress. Madame Carnal goes to her and confirms if it's true she reprimanded Lisa, and she asks if Lisa had said that since she was speaking thoughtlessly in the morning, so she made her leave. She asks why, but Madame Carnal only asks if she's going somewhere, and she responds that she has to get ready for her dinner with the Emperor. Madame Carnal tells her she forgot to inform her, but the dinner has been cancelled. She tells her she's not exactly sure, but it appears that the Emperor is unwell. Hours ago, the Emperor went horse riding to relieve his anger from the noble council with his personal knight. They stop and he asks him why he'd brought him a black horse and not the white one, and he replies that his white horse is missing. He tells the Emperor she vanished that morning and he was yet to hear any progress with the search, so he brought the black one instead. As the Emperor walks, he wonders how that could have happened. She was one of my favorite horses unless she flew into the sky. As he recalls the Grand Duke's appearance, his eyes fill with realization as he recalls that he'd heard a horse from the yard before going for the conference. He questions whether it could have been a cry for help, imagining the Grand Duke incomplete creature devouring it. Finally, he notices the sense in Kuro being in the yard at that time. Everything adds up at last, but there is no evidence. Annoyed, the Emperor mutters that he knows it is Kuro, but he has no evidence, and he's going to make sure to end his life and rescue his horse-trapped Kuro's incomplete creature. Suddenly, the Emperor kneels on the ground in pain. He thinks of how he can't do anything about it and questions when his spirit animal would come out. "This is tormenting me." He reflects on how when he obtained the ability to inject power into the divine sword, people supposedly saw a faint silhouette around him, which was a tiger. He bites his lower lip and mumbles that he will get rid of him and rescue his horse. Later, Anton goes into the Emperor's room, but the Emperor's sword quickly flies in his direction and holds at his neck. He reveals that he is Anton and the Emperor withdraws the sword. He goes to the Emperor, who lies in pain, and reflects on how the Emperor's chronic illness happened after a disease that took the lives of his parents a year after the other, and also when the divine animal went to Kuro first. He silently hopes that the Emperor's spirit animal reappears as soon as possible and his animal puts an end to the pain and agony. They hear a knock on the door and go to open it, but unexpectedly they find the Empress standing. I came to see if Kalik was okay," she says. A few hours ago at the Empress's palace, she blushed at the thought of not having to see him that day, but her nanny offered to help her get ready. Her nanny explained that she was the Empress and should go pay him a visit, and thinking she could also use the opportunity to win his heart, she agreed. The present time, the Baron looks, reflecting on how he'd heard news that the Empress had changed, but it would be impossible for her to come and see if the Emperor is okay. He thinks about how both the Empress and Kuro are the Emperor's two archenemies and questions why she looks so different that night. The Baron hesitates before responding to her request. explaining that it's not a good time, revealing that the emperor has issued strict orders forbidding anyone from entering. She tries to confirm his condition from the Baron when they hear the emperor yell in pain. She trembles and the Baron questions why she would decide to come if she was going to be frightened, and then thinks to get rid of her quickly and go back to the emperor. The emperor tells her she's heard the emperor and he's still in a worse condition, hinting that she should leave. However, she states that she would be back the next day. She asks if she will be able to see him again the next day, and he replies that he will have to see before going back to the emperor, who arises and asks if it was the Empress. The Baron reports that she came to find out if he was okay and he sent her away for the night. Do you intend to see her, your majesty? The next day, the Empress goes to the emperor with tea and finds him in a better condition than she'd thought. He asks what she has with her and she explains that it's her get-well-soon gift. She tells him it's cold black tea that she made thanks to her nanny's teaching, but he coldly asks if she's planning to kill him with it. Unexpectedly, she pours out some of the tea into a teacup and drinks it, and then asks if he's satisfied, remarking that the tea is safe. However, the emperor tells her poison doesn't live one immediately, as it needs time to spread through the body. She springs up with a frown and swirls around for a while, and when she finally stops she asks if she doesn't look fine, remarking that he can now drink it. The emperor glances at the teacup and says that he only drinks hot tea. She tells him she likes cold tea and he sighs, saying it is boring. She wonders if that is his way of saying get out, and reflects on how if her life wasn't at stake she wouldn't have avoided or run away from him like that. Kalik is supposed to be the most frightful person in the world, but at the same time he's the most pathetic as well. And to him, I'm just someone who has to prove herself, she thinks. She lunges at the emperor and asks, Kalik, what must I do to alleviate your boredom? He tells her he didn't know she could be quite persistent and asks if she believes she can entertain him. She tells the emperor she doesn't exactly think that, and instead she simply wants to do what she can. Then sing, he says, or dance. She tells him she will sing, thinking singing is less embarrassing, and she begins singing the song her mother used to sing to her whenever she fell ill. However, her voice is so bad that it causes him to have an ear bleed. He tells her she has absolutely no talent in singing and she apologizes for her lack of skills. But I could see that you tried your best, which was quite funny. Her eyes widens and she goes to him and tells him she made him laugh, but his expression is cold again and he says he was saying that was the most laughable moment of all. The Baron walks in to catch both the Emperor and Empress laughing together, and he becomes stiff as he confirms that the Emperor is truly laughing and questions what the Empress is trying to get out of that. Has she truly transformed? The Baron notices the Emperor taking cold tea and asks if he didn't prefer hot tea, and he replies that it was tricky holding a hot drink with his injured hand. The Baron tells the Emperor he's so glad he's happy, and the Emperor replies asking whether he looks happy. He explains to the Baron that he hadn't expected her to sing so hard, and the Baron remarks that it feels strange to see how much she's changed. The Baron reports to the Emperor that since the assembly the previous month, the nobles have been showing suspicious movements, and some even doubt his ability to summon a divine creature, and at the center of the gossip there is the Grand Duke Kuro and his court. The Baron tells the Emperor that the divine wolf appeared when the former Emperor was 25 and he was married at 23, and both the Emperor and Empress loved each other very much. Perhaps an intercourse may be crucial in bringing out a creature, and you have abstained from women for a long time now, the Baron adds. With a cold gaze, the Emperor asks to know what he's suggesting, and he says despite the change it isn't safe to trust the Empress fully, and suggests he improves his condition through another woman. How graceful. Just say that I should gratify my sexual desire. The Emperor says, looking at him, I shall keep that in mind. As the Baron steps out of the Emperor's room, he runs into the Grand Duke, who asks if he isn't the bastard Grand Duke. The Baron stops and says he feels honored that he stopped to speak to him, calling him his dear brother, and Kuro replies that it disgusts him that a bastard is considered his half-brother. The Baron explains that although her family had collapsed, his mother was a noble lady, and 2 years after her death, their father remarried his mother and gave birth to him, which is the widely known truth. He tells him in that country he is the only one who treats him as a bastard child. Kuro warns him to watch his tone, saying it is lamentable that even the unqualified can become a Grand Duke these days, and the Baron replies that it surely includes him, reminding him that he is the firstborn. Kuro then tells him he shall wait and see how long he can survive in a crumbling house, because he plans to rebuild the house and become its new owner, and in that house there will be no room for bastards. The Baron pulls him in a fit, asking how he dares covet the throne, but he slaps his hand off and replies that a humble breed tends to rely on violence easily, and he doesn't have time for filth. You may interpret it as you please. Later at night, Lisa prepares the Empress for bed. She inquires about the Emperor, and the Empress tells her he seemed a bit sick, and Lisa celebrates that it's good news. She tells her she felt bad for getting annoyed the other day, so she prepared a gift. I hope you like it, Your Majesty. Lisa finishes. She pulls the door and a blindfolded man steps out and kneels in her presence. Your Majesty, the beautiful Empress, will you give me the honor to spend this night with you? Lisa, she calls, I have specifically ordered that no men are allowed into the Empress's palace. Did you disobey my order and bring in a man? She asks. Lisa responds that that was why she snuck him in, and she'd also chosen a man who resembled her favorite knight the most. She asks if with his eyes covered he doesn't look almost identical, and proceeds to ask what she thinks, smiling brightly, but instead she gets a slap across the face. The Empress reminds her that she already gave her a warning, and warns her again to never flatter her in such a way. The maid, who is shocked by her response, raises her voice asking if she's serious, saying she doesn't know why she's mad at her since she's an excellent maid who knows her type of man. The Empress declares, I'll let it slide today, but you will no longer be my maid, however. The maid clutches her dress desperately, begging for another chance. She reminds her mistress of the times she showed loyalty, how she always favored her, gave her jewels and dresses, and even risked her life to help her elope with the prince. Hearing this, her expression changes as she skeptically asks if Lisa really aided her in escaping with the prince. Deep in thought, she acknowledges Lisa's loyalty to her. But I know this kind of person can cause big problems, so I should keep her as far away as possible. The Empress orders her to leave with the man. I will punish you later for sneaking a man into my palace, and from now on your access to the Empress palace is permanently denied. The next day at lunch, Kalek's face is expressionless. Noticing her, he asks if today's meal suits her taste better than the last. She immediately begins yapping about the meal, and when she notices his gaze, she stops. The Emperor remarks that her current expression is much better than the dreadful ones she used to make, and adds that if he had known she would eat so well, he would have told the kitchen to prepare more food. She calls the Emperor, thinking to inform him about canceling the contest. About the Mr. Carton contest, she says, but he doesn't let her finish before he declares that he wouldn't be raising the budget boy even by a single gold. Belita stays stiff while the Emperor glares at her, thinking he knew all along, and questions whether that was why she tried so hard to impress him. He begins to think, with the money she had been squandering every year, I could have supplied one more loaf of bread to each soldier. However, the Empress shocks him with her response. She reveals that she is thinking of canceling the event forever. He asks what she would do with the 500,000 gold coins then, and she responds that she believes it could be better used where it's needed. He asks if she's sure, explaining that with that much money she could own several houses in the capital. She refuses and says she only wanted to inform him that she would no longer hold the event. She notices her teacup is empty, and the Emperor immediately notifies the maids, ordering them to bring more cold black tea. Her heart skips at the thought that he remembered something she liked even though he was avoiding her at the time, and she thought he wasn't paying attention. Thank you, Kalek, with a bright smile, and for a second he's lost in her gaze. She's definitely changed. When we were walking in the garden and when I was sick, she wasn't plotting to be with more men. That Belita who is more known for her lust. Wait, men, am I her new target? The Emperor questions. He tries to take a cup of tea to relax himself, but he ends up dropping the cup, drawing Belita's immediate attention as she springs up and goes to him, checking to see his burn. It's red. Does it hurt much? We need a doctor, Belita says. The Emperor, paying much attention to her gentleness, feels his heart beat faster and thinks, this is not good. This emotion is not good. Belita glances up at the Emperor, who just stares blankly and lets go of his hand out of embarrassment. She tells the Emperor he would need to take his burn to a doctor, but he only tells her he doesn't need a doctor for that. He pushes her hand away when she tries to check the burn and steps out. When he finally gets out in the corridor, he pauses and raises his hand, thinking this is unacceptable, and he may be wrong, but based on her behavior so far it is obvious that Belita no longer fools around with men. She also abolished her contest, her favorite event. Evidently she is looking for her next prey. And that next prey is me. Later in the Emperor's office, Grand Duke Bane notices him distracted and wonders what might have transpired between him and Belita. He hands him the final document for his review and explains that it is a letter from Felon about food and supplies for the upcoming expedition, and they intend to double their offerings. The Emperor is startled that they will do that voluntarily and concludes that the king must have heard that he didn't unalive Belita, then he's asking him to look after her. The Emperor further contemplates that given the swift response they might already be aware that he's her next target. Grand Duke Bane calls the Emperor's attention, and the Emperor responds, instructing him to tell them to triple the amount. Belita, I have to know why you're doing this to me now, and the king's answer will reveal Belita's true intent. At night in House Santino, a person knocks on the Duke's door, but he orders him to leave. The servant doesn't leave and instead informs him that the Grand Duke Kuro has sent a gift. He immediately rushes to him to find out what it is, and he tells him that it's the first-rate wine from the Brunoir Palace, and also a note that says, "Get well soon, I feel so lonely without you." His eyes fill with tears as he drops to the ground thinking, he's the only one who cares about him, and he will return to his side as quickly as possible. At the same time, the Grand Duke Kuro remarks that Santino should have received his gift. He calls him a simple-minded idiot and says that transparency is what makes it easier to control him. The red-haired widow beside tells him he seems to be in a good mood, and he asks why wouldn't I be. He summons his spirit animal and remarks that everything is going smoothly and his beast is growing bigger and stronger, that he can almost feel the change in his body. The lady also adds that it indeed has become clearer and whiter than the last time, and he asks if she thinks so. Although it is still unstable, I can keep practicing and strengthening our bond. Unlike someone who doesn't have one, he must be devastated. Only a few months left. If the Emperor's beast doesn't appear by then, the great throne will be mine. In a new scene, the Empress's maids get her ready. They praise her beauty and mention that anyone who sees her that day will fall in love with her, including the Emperor. She looks at herself and questions whether Kalik would also find her pretty, while the maids search for more adornments. Madame Carnal appears pleased with the new atmosphere around the palace following Belita's change. Before, the servants desperately tried to avoid her, but now it's quite the opposite. Later, Kalik and Belita sit by the lake. She notices the Emperor looking tired and wonders if perhaps he had troubles sleeping the previous night. She finally summons up the courage to ask if he would like to take a nap. "Now? Here? On your lap?" the Emperor asks, leaving her both surprised and embarrassed. She concludes that he's making fun of her again and admits to herself that after singing the other day, she doesn't feel so ashamed any longer. She pats her lap softly and tells him to rest his head there, but the Emperor just looks at her, conveying a sense of irritation through his lips. She asks why he's looking at her like that, and he says nothing. The Emperor agrees and places his head on her lap, and when she glances back at the Emperor, she notices he's fallen fast asleep. She gently strokes his head, admiring his warm smile rather than his usual stern look. As she pats his hair, the Emperor senses a familiar feeling. When he was the prince, his father would place his head on his mother's lap and they would chatter together, and watching them he slowly drifted off to sleep. "I know this feeling of peace and comfort. This must be my mother stroking my hair, but it's not possible since she passed away." Then, the Emperor slowly opens his eyes and calls, "Belita." She asks how his rest was while he struggles to believe that he'd fallen asleep with his head on her lap. "Unbelievable. Slowly and unnoticeably I'm seeing more entangled in her." The Emperor, with his usual stern look on his face, calls her and asks the reason for her sudden change. She tells him she's only trying to be the Empress, but he cuts her off and says she isn't Belita. This statement sends panic through her body. However, the Emperor doesn't just stop there, he demands to know who she is. The Emperor questions the reason for the sudden change. "Maybe I changed too much. The change was too drastic and obvious, I know, but if I acted like my past self, he would have ended my life. So what am I supposed to do?" "Do you not like the change?" Belita responds. "As you said, I've been trying to behave like an empress. I had been rather immature before. So to prove myself as a true empress, I had to transform myself into a whole other person in order to become a proper empress." The Emperor then asks if she's willing to do anything to be a qualified empress. "Absolutely anything." She remains quiet, and the Emperor says he will take that as a yes, so whatever he makes her do from then on, she shall keep the promise. "Yes, I promise," she says. The emperor watches her for a moment before saying, since she's making an effort as empress, he will trust her this time. He adds that his doubts now seem unwarranted. Before she used to, she attempts to stand but trips on her dress, calling out to the emperor to be careful. At the main palace, the maids decide to go check on the emperor and empress since it's getting late, but when they arrive their cheeks turns red as they find the both of them on each other. When Belita finally realizes, she springs up and apologizes saying she tripped. He tells her it's fine and instructs her to just move over. Belita, you will take responsibility for this, he says. In a new scene, the emperor wipes his hair dry and speaks about his body being wet from the hot spring. No, it's not just hot, it's burning. This is different from the seizure last time. My body has grown uncomfortably hot. The emperor steps out onto the balcony and calls Belita's name out loud. He thinks it has begun. Today she made a bold attempt to seduce me. He ponders that she must have done the same thing to other men and clenches his fist tightly, questioning how she dares challenge him under the pretense of having changed. He thinks her excuse sounds plausible, but he's not so naive as to fall for it and declares that he will take her challenge. Right now. The emperor goes into her room, and when she asks what he's doing there so late at night, he tells her he's there to finish what she started. Confused, she wonders what is there to finish. The emperor lifts her face and says, what we were doing in the woods. Holding her jaw, she wonders if it was the kiss in the woods and pulls back softly, asking why now. He reminds her that earlier she said she changed to become a proper empress and instructs her to prove it then. The emperor warns her not to faint this time, but she grabs his hand and asks if that part of the process is to prove her abilities as the empress, and he says of course. Then promise me that you wouldn't take my life even after this 1 week, she declares. The emperor goes closer and tells her that is no longer the issue. For I've decided not to get rid of you. She wonders if his decision is only temporary and confirms if he means permanently. He says yes unless she commits some unforgivable sin, and she asks why since he already tried to. He tells her he doesn't understand himself either since he nearly did. Before. I just can't stop thinking about you. The emperor finishes. He kisses her while she thinks it's too intense, sleeping her off her feet more forcefully than before. At this point, I don't even remember that kiss in the woods. Kalik, wait. I can't breathe, Belita mumbles. She pulls away to catch her breath, and when the emperor asks if she's done, she says not yet. He grabs her and asks why she keeps running away, ordering her to not move as he was still yet to begin. The emperor kisses her and thinks to himself that he didn't know her lips were so entrancing. I know she kissed other men more deeply than this. No, I know she did more than just kissing, but this Belita feels different. She feels new, like a whole other woman, and so do her lips. Suddenly the emperor feels an immense pain, and as she checks to see if he's all right, a bright light fills the room and a wolf's feet appears. Later, the emperor lays in bed sweating profusely while she checks to see if he has a fever. She reflects on the image that appeared briefly resembling Kalik's divine creature. Before she falls asleep, she tells him to live and adds that they should survive everything together. The next day, Madame Carnal is astonished by the sight in presence. She wonders how she couldn't notice their relationship when she was with her all day. She steps outside thinking, Your Majesty, I hope you have found the right man this time, and if that man is His Majesty, I cannot wish for more. Later, the emperor sits in his office. He reflects on how he'd gotten up in the morning and how she'd held his hand while he was about to leave and exclaims, Belita, I cannot believe I shared the bed with her. He reflects on how he had never kissed a lady like this since his only focus was expanding the territory, but it was burning and the thought of it gives him a headache. He murmurs, also ecstatic, thinking of how he could still feel her at the tip of his tongue, thinking no wonder she has dominated that many men. The temptation is quite hard to resist. He found himself questioning whether she would come again that day and reflecting on how he guaranteed her safety. He thinks, I bet she's not. She's achieved her goal. But is she really not going to come? Perhaps she has gone back to her old self, then obviously she would not come. But if she comes today, then evidently I am her target. I heard that once Belita has her eyes on a man, she has to have him. So if she come, he gets distracted by a knock on the door and instantly his eyes turn to the door. At the Empress's palace earlier that morning. Belita yawns, and when the nanny asks if he's tired, she says yes, she couldn't sleep much. The nanny chuckles, saying she supposes the emperor kept her awake all night, but she clarifies that it's not like that. As the nanny squeals over the thought that they'd shared the night together, she's deep in thought, questioning whether she still has to go see him. She wonders if since he'd said he wouldn't live her, it means she passed the test. She's unable to decide on whether to go see him or not, and soon her nanny notices and asks if perhaps she's thinking of the Emperor. She tells her it's too complicated, and the nanny asks if it feels like her face is burning and something presses on her heart. Do you feel down and can't think of something else? Belita reflects on how whenever she thinks of the Emperor, automatically she thinks of the kiss they shared the previous night, so of course her face becomes hot. I feel pressured because I can't decide whether to go or not, and I'm too sleepy to think of anything else. All I think of is that I want to sleep, Belita thinks. Belita tells her nanny she thinks she does feel all of that, and her nanny looks at her thinking it's clear and congratulates her on being lovesick. She grabs her hand and suggests they hurry, and when she asks where, she says to the Emperor, of course. Madame Carnal goes to Mr. Eaton and informs him that the Empress would like to see the Emperor. He tells her it wouldn't be possible as the Duke has been waiting to report something extremely important. Finally, she reveals to him that the Empress is lovesick and misses the Emperor greatly, so they must help her. Sir Eaton tells her he's heard she's changed, remarking that it's all too sudden, and asks if she wasn't surprised, but the nanny responds that love doesn't come with warnings. Belita finally stands in the presence of the Emperor, and he offers her to take a seat. He mentions that she has changed the appointment schedule to come in first and adds that he hopes it's worth it. She calls the Emperor and he looks, thinking, yes. Say something. Reveal your agenda, Belita. She mentions his divine creature piquing his interest and then asks if it is a tiger. The Emperor walks up to her without wasting a second and demands to know how she knows about his beast. As he stares at her, he reflects on how only a handful of high-ranking nobles, Anton and Dale, know that information, and if she's heard it from somewhere, she might have connections with the corp. Kalik, no, I saw it, she says instead. She reveals that she'd seen his divine creature, the tiger, the time when they kissed. She tells him when they kissed she saw it right before he fell asleep, although it disappeared right away. He asks what it looked like and she goes ahead to describe it. It was humongous, enough to fill my entire bedchamber, and it looked absolutely vicious, a bit like you. The Emperor is stiff and he contemplates if it's that huge and vicious, then it is fully grown, and if she's telling the truth, it is complete, unlike Kuro's goal. He clenches his fists, thinking of how much he wants to believe her, for he has desperately waited for that moment, but if she's lying he might change his decision in one day and take her life. She continues describing it. So huge that it looked like it could swallow both of us in one gulp, and those ferocious golden eyes, they resembled yours. With a bright smile, she asks if that was worth changing the schedule then. He appears to be in a daze for a while before responding that it was worth it. He grabs her hand and pulls her to him, and when she asks what he's doing, he tells her he cannot no longer hold it. Can we do it here? Outside, Mr. Anton is about to open the door, but Madame Carnal stops him, asking him to read the air. She tells him to leave them alone and adds that they're in love for the first time and they should be supporters rather than obstacles. Inside the office, Belita reflects on how her heart is about to burst whenever she sees him, even more so because she knows what is going to happen. Do I like him? She kisses the Emperor, and when she stops she asks if she should come again the next day. The Emperor then asks if she wouldn't come unless he forces her to, and she says that's not it and she will come. Yes, that is my Belita, the Emperor finishes. Beluga steps out of the office and wonders what could be on the Emperor's mind and whether he also likes her. Later her nanny serves her tea and asks if she had a good time with the Emperor. Belita responds that instead it was an important time, thinking of how nothing means more to him compared to the divine beast, although for her it's enough of a headache to think about the kissing. It is great that she got to tell him about his beast. Suddenly, Belita drops from the chair, crashing the teacup while Madame Carnal hurries to her, calling for help from anyone outside. At the same time, the Emperor panics after learning that the Empress has collapsed. Anton explains that she took her medicine and fell asleep, but the fever isn't getting better and is probably because of her weak condition. The Emperor immediately rushes to her and stays by her side, placing a damp towel on her head. He wonders if she was unwell the same time she came to his office. The Emperor feels bad for not noticing her condition and reflects on how sensitively he behaved because of the divine beast, but however he concludes that Belita must have a connection to its sudden appearance. He calls her name softly as he strokes her hair and says, "Get well soon." At the same time at the Emperor's palace, people try to stop the Grand Duke from going into his office when the Emperor appears. He glances at the beast with his white horse inside and suggests they go inside first. In the office, Kuro asks the Emperor if he's noticed how beautifully his beast has grown, but the Emperor doesn't pay any heed to him. Kuro admits that he should have read the room, bringing up his white horse that disappeared, while Kalik tries to hold himself back, questioning how the Grand Duke dares mock him, the Emperor. The Grand Duke warns him to keep an eye on his horse, stating that it is unknown since the white horse might not be the only one. Kuro reflects on how his horse was acting strange for a few days, and then it decided to keep him in check by swallowing his horse. The Emperor instantly orders him to stay shut, but he begins to feel the same pain he felt that night, and unexpectedly, his divine beast appears in the form of a tiger, terrifying the Grand Duke, who rushes immediately to his carriage, unable to comprehend what had just unfolded right in front of his eyes. In his carriage, he reflects on how the main purpose of his visit was to laugh at his devastated face, but in the end the roles ended up being switched. Why does he have a beast? He questions. He realizes that the rumors about his tiger were true, and also all his plans regarding the throne would go away. He reflects on how it appeared like the Emperor couldn't bring out his animal at his will, so the only way for him to have the upper hand back is to start the plan earlier and take his life. He deliberates on how neither assassination nor prison would work in a palace guarded by Anton, so his only option is a war, and he appears to have an aide. Later at night, Belita is woken up by a knock on the door. Mistaking it for Madame Carnal, she invites her in, but everywhere goes silent again, so she decides to go back to sleep. In less than a minute, she hears someone bang on her door and finally opens it. She notices the sound coming from the dressing room, so she decides to go check, and upon closer inspection she hears the sound coming from the floor. She wonders who would try to sneak into her room in the middle of the night and pulls up the carpet to find Duke Santino. He apologizes for being late and explains how others complain about how difficult it has become to come into her palace, having no clue that they share a secret passage. She realizes that if anyone can sneak in like rats into the Empress's palace, the Kor and Emer can always come and threaten her. She asks the Duke who else knows about the passage, and he says it is between the two of them and no one else. He grabs her hand, declaring that she wouldn't know how much he waits for their monthly get-together. He tells her he's old but quite strong, and it thrilled him when she mentioned that he was much better than the young ones. So as always, you can trust me tonight. She jerks away from him, but he finds her reaction quite odd and asks what the matter is, adding that she should let him inside. He tells her he can't wait to have another steamy night, and this time she grabs a vase and hits him on the head with it. Carnal rushes in to defend Belit, who asks him what he would do when the Emperor finds out. Recalling how he narrowly escaped death, he tells her she was the one who seduced him first and asks her to go on and tell the Emperor, and they shall see if she will be saved from his wrath. As she wonders what to do, she questions how her former self would kick him out, and finally she tells him men like him are terribly boring. She informs him that she will be blocking the passage and orders him never to come near her again. She goes back to bed, and her nanny asks why she was having an affair with Santino since she's so much better than him. They agree to keep it a secret with each other and also block the passage as soon as possible. In a new scene, the Kor all gather, and a man asks Duke Santino if he'd returned home late, saying some people saw his carriage late at night. The man also mentions how he visited around the same time last month and asks who he's seeing so covertly, adding that he must tell the Grand Duke. Duke Santino tells him he had some business, but the Grand Duke adds that he's curious as to what that could be. He reflects on how he's kept the secret so far, but after being kicked out he sees no reason why, and she openly claimed that he no longer interested her. He asks the men not to be surprised, following that last night he'd gone to visit the Empress Belita. The Grand Duke is all interested and asks if he would elaborate on it. The others mention how it is practically impossible to visit the Empress in those days, while Santino mentions that there is a way, and she was incredibly welcoming the previous night, and then they had the most special, magnificent night together. He goes on to brag about how much she glowed beautifully in the moonlight and how the fact that he was the only man to be allowed inside was an honor beyond words. Duke Santino reflects on how it was all thanks to the secret passage, something they would never know unless he reveals it. His family's wealth comes from constructing the palaces, the blueprints which have been passed down from generation to generation, so the only one who knows about every existing passage is him, Santino. A man doesn't buy it and brings up how he'd left the palace completely drenched, and he explains that while taking a bath, the Empress suddenly pulled him into the tub. They all giggle, but the Grand Duke orders them to give him and Santino a minute since he has a lot of questions and he hopes he will have some good answers. At the Empress's palace, Madame Carnal lectures Belita about her health, as soon as she wakes up explaining that she's only that weak because she does nothing but stay in bed all day, only leaving her room when she has appointments with the Emperor. In a new scene, the Emperor prefers his personal knight to teach Beluga how to ride a horse, stating that he's too busy to do it himself and he's to do it for him. Sir Anton watches Belita try to ride the horse after falling from a stationary horse many times. He reflects on how he'd heard she was good at horse riding and questions how it's possible, as she doesn't appear to have even the basic skills, almost like it's her first time. Did she lose her memories? Suddenly, she slips off the horse and luckily Anton catches her. She sighs a breath of relief as she thanks him, but he begins scolding her, saying it's ridiculous and she could have gotten severely hurt. She apologizes, saying she was only trying to get better quickly, and he tells her she keeps falling off because she's nervous. He instructs her to hop back on and relax, and sensing her resilience, he questions why she would try so hard even with the Emperor's absence. He thinks she has definitely changed, but he must think straight because she is capable of playing with others just for entertainment, so at least he mustn't be fooled. In a new scene, Duke Santino shows the Grand Duke the secret passage that goes outside the palace that no one else knows of except him. The Grand Duke then asks why he'd kept it a secret even from him, and he replies that he was only waiting for the right moment. Duke Santino, noticing the Grand Duke's curiosity and eagerness, senses that as an opportunity to outrun the other dukes and secure a position. The Grand Duke asks what he'd discussed with the Empress. He replies that truly they didn't have much time to talk, and the Grand Duke asks if he didn't mention that he spent a special time with her. He confesses that they did have intercourse together a few times before, but that night he met her, she threw him out, and he's unsure if she's moved on to either the prince or the Emperor. The Grand Duke mutters, "Intercourse with Belita." He pats the Duke on his shoulder, thanking him for the information, assuring to make good use of it. He adds that when that day comes he will be handsomely rewarded. Later, the Grand Duke sits recalling how Duke Santino mentioned the use of the passage to fool around with him, calling it a disgrace. He thinks that it is intolerable that he has shared that woman with his vassal. He reflects on how Duke Santino has been useful in steering public opinion before the Emperor or bringing information like that. But Belita, you do not care about anything so long as he is a man. First you elope with Emer, then you walk past me like a stranger, how dare you? He thinks. The red-haired widow tries to check on him, but he slaps her and orders her to get out and not speak to him. Belita, you can't have forgotten our deal. The audacity to behave in this manner. With this blueprint in my hand, I shall revise my plan after I handle this first, he proclaims. In the prison, Emer sings while holding a doll, "My lovely Belita, I can't wait to see you." A few days later, Madame Carnal remarks to Belita that she doesn't seem to meet up with the Emperor often, and she responds that it's because he's busy. Reflecting on how it's been a while since the beast came out, she wonders what he could be doing. Sama Karnk continues and mentions that they already shared a bed together and questions how he could just leave and not come back. Belita denies it strongly, that her nanny pauses and asks if they're still yet to consummate their marriage. She acts confused, and Madame Carnal remarks that she knows it's not possible and she was simply just wondering. Her nanny tells her the Emperor must be missing her already and adds that it is about time that he came. However, Belita dismisses it, adding that it's already late. Unexpectedly, the Emperor walks into her room. He goes straight to bed and mutters about how tired he is. He calls her to come lay beside him, but she worries that he's going to do something again this time. The Emperor assures her that he wouldn't do anything, but he will spend the night there with her. Belita hurries to the door in shock, and the Emperor is impressed by her speed. However, he orders his sword to go bring her, and as it floats above her, an odd sense of familiarity accompanies it. Terrified, she retreats, but the sword appears behind her, forcing her toward the Emperor. She finally climbs onto the bed, and the Emperor calmly remarks that she might fall off. She turns to him and says he forced her to lie down, but the Emperor doesn't argue any further. He rises and leans over her, the simple action triggering memories of her conversation with her nanny earlier that morning. Crossing her hand over her chest, she tells the Emperor she doesn't think they've bonded enough to consummate their marriage, but instead he pulls her closer to him. He asks if she's worried about consummation, and as she stammers trying to explain, he asks if there's any chance that's what she's been thinking about. At this point, she feels her heart beating out of her chest, but the Emperor asks her not to worry, mentioning that he only came to sleep. "I'm over what happened 4 years ago," he finishes. 4 years ago, Kalek was obsessed with territorial expansion, practically living on battlefields, and he married Belita, a felon, to solidify the sovereign-vassal relationship. However, on their wedding night, it was a time when blood hardly dried on Kalek, blood from war and from the palace from rooting out traitors. When she saw him drenched in blood, she rejected him and called him a filthy murderer. In a new scene, the Prince Emer arrives in a carriage with a blindfold over his eyes, reflecting on how he was in the prison and questioning why he's there with his eyes covered. He questions who it could have been to bring him out and suddenly recalls Belita and turns around asking to know if she was the one who'd brought him out. "Darling, please come to me," he says joyfully. However, the horse stops and a man pulls down his blindfold, demanding to know if he recognizes him. He turns to the Grand Duke and asks if he was the one who pulled him out and not Belita, and Kuro remarks that he would have been dead if not for him. He asks how and why he'd be rescued, however Kuro just responds that how means nothing, adding that what matters is that he'd saved his life. The prince bluntly asks what he wants from him, and Kuro replies that he would like to talk. He informs him that first he would be sent safely back to his kingdom of Roka, and the next he reveals with a grin on his face. After a while, Emer asks if he wants him to bring troop when it happens. He tells him he wasn't aware of his ambition and asks if he will execute Kalek and assume the throne himself. Grand Duke Kuro responds saying yes, he will be the emperor, and to ensure the death of the war maniac Kalek, he will require Roka's support. He adds that once he becomes emperor, he will repay the favor by giving him Felon, Belita's country. Emer responds that his offer sounds tempting but asks why he would do that. He tells him he's aware that Roka has been looking for a war to invade Kartan, and if he waits the crown will be his without need to rush. He tells him he wonders what caused him to jump out of his skin, but the Grand Duke replies that for his people he plans to have one battle and finalize everything rather than living a painful life under the war maniac's regime. He then asks if he wouldn't prefer to live in the peaceful city he is about to build. However, Emer doesn't believe that is the real reason. Has the Emperor shown signs of a divine beast? Emer asks, and the Duke flinches before responding that it is absurd. His tone becomes cold as he states it was a mistake to bring him there, and instead he should have been left to rot in the dungeon. Emer shudders, insisting he was only joking, while the Duke calmly responds with an "all right," and adds that they should all benefit. "Then promise me one thing, Belita. You must give her to me," Emer requests. He adds that he will take her with him back to his kingdom and make her his queen as planned, and Kuro agrees, thinking nothing is more important than the throne. In a new scene, the Emperor wakes up the next morning questioning when he'd fallen asleep and also why he falls asleep so easily there. He asks himself whether he finds it comfortable to be with her and whether he actually. They have a meal together in the courtyard and Belita decides to start a conversation. She asks him what his schedule is like that day, and he replies that he has to meet up with Duke Logan after their meal, and also he has heaps of documents waiting for his review. The Emperor brings up horseback riding the other day and suggests they meet up after work, saying he must see her skills. He tells her he will visit in the evening, and she asks if they're going to meet 3 times a day. Instead of answering, he simply asks if she has a problem with it. When she says no, he nods and, before leaving, tells her he'll see her later. Later, the Emperor walks with Anton, who senses he's in a good mood and assumes it's because he met up with the Empress. He reflects on how his emotions become more visible whenever he spends time with her, since normally his cold and emotionless face doesn't betray any thoughts or feelings. As he questions whether it is something to be happy about, they hear someone ask if it is a good thing. Following with how he can't get a grasp, has His Majesty finally fallen in love with Her Majesty? Anton tries to punish them, but the Emperor stops him and asks that they listen instead. They discuss how they'd heard the Emperor ram to the Empress's chambers in the middle of the night with great haste, and also how he didn't have time to adjust his robe while running, but that was because it was right after he took a bath. And then he came back in the morning. Did they finally consummate their marriage? They discuss further, and the Emperor walks up to them asking if they'd heard anything else, gossip about the Emperor. He tells them he had no idea that servants would be interested in it, and immediately they go down pleading for mercy. however the emperor doesn't punish them. He instructs them to look up and continue talking. He asks if they think he and the empress have gotten closer, and they say yes. They mention how the other day he was walking by the lake with the empress and her face was like that of a woman in love. The emperor asks if she was indeed looking at him that way, and they say yes and mention that he also looked at her with warmth. They continue apologizing, however the emperor just says there's nothing to apologize for, he understands. He tells them he also particularly liked the part they just mentioned, and when they ask what part he replies, the part about how we've gotten closer, keep spreading so everyone can know. Later, the emperor sits in his office with documents questioning when it will all end. I need to see Belita. She amuses me and relieves all the work-related stress. Especially that carrot-colored face, he thinks. His knight notices and tells him that if he must he will assist the empress with the horse again, however the emperor glares at him asking why he would do so. Anton sighs before mentioning how he has stopped riding since his white horse went missing. He goes down and says it is true that he has replaced him whenever he was too busy, but if he doesn't feel comfortable again, he can. The emperor declines and says he can no longer postpone it, and just because he has a painful memory it doesn't mean he can ignore his other horses. He clenches his fist as he thinks, this insult from Kuro must be overcome someday, until I find my white horse. In the Empress's palace, she finishes sealing the trapdoor used by Santino by nailing iron plates on it. She turns her head to find Kalik's robe on the chair, and when she asks if Kalik by chance had left his robe, her nanny tells her she placed it there herself. She explains that since the emperor keeps visiting that would add to the convenience, and for permission she already spoke to his assistant about it. She looks around and begins to take notice of other of Kalik's possessions that have been placed in her room and exclaims it is too much. In the evening, the emperor goes to Belita and apologizes for being late. They hop on the horse, and when the emperor notices she isn't moving, he asks if she isn't going to gallop, and she replies that she's still working on it. He tells her galloping feels great and adds that he often either rides his black or white horse and runs across the field at top speed. She asks if he rides often, and he says yes, adding that it's his hobby. He extends his hand asking if she'll join him. She accepts, and he pulls her onto his horse and warns her to hold tight, stating that he will speed up. He takes off at full speed, and her hand trembles as the thought of falling off the horse crosses her mind. The emperor warns that she might fall and tells her to look forward, however she's in doubt. He asks her to trust him, and finally she opens her eyes and looks forward to the beautiful view of the sunset. What do you think? I knew you'd love it, the emperor remarks. She replies that it's beautiful, and gradually she found herself getting used to the speed. She asks the emperor if she will be able to gallop one day, and he says yes, he believes she can. They stop for a break, and when the emperor notices her fondness for the horse, he remarks that she can have the horse if she likes him that much. She's astonished, and he adds that it's not easy to take care of a horse, and yet she did. Take care of him yourself. He will become an even greater horse as you practice together. She tells him she will, thanking him with a bright smile. However, the emperor asks, why don't you express your gratitude then? Not just by words but through action. She wonders if he's asking for a kiss again and gets on her toes. As they kiss, he pulls harder at her shirt, causing the button to come off. His eyes look down at her ripped shirt. Kalik. The emperor turns around, and when she notices she exclaims. In a new scene, she informs the emperor that they wouldn't be sharing the bed that day. He asks why, and she explains that they've been sleeping together for days already, and also her body is sore from horseback riding. However, the emperor is indifferent. He asks what that has to do with him sleeping there, adding that he can see his personal items. Are they not a sign of welcome? She retreats, saying she would like to spend her time alone, and the emperor asks how she can be so cold after the passionate seduction in the afternoon. Frustrated, she slams the door and exclaims that it was only because he pulled her blouse, and he apologized for doing so, adding that she rests well. As the emperor returns to his room, he runs into his assistant, who informs him that Prince Emer has broken out of the prison. The emperor tells him it took longer than he expected, and he'd thought he would attempt it sooner. He explains that his plan was to use that as an opportunity to root out the spies, but they managed to lose the palace tropes and disappear completely. The emperor then adds that their men searched the area and discovered on the west tower wall a small hole that they must have escaped through. Like some barbaric beasts, it suits them well, the emperor scoffs. The emperor, deep in thought, wonders who could have helped him escape, whether there are spies around him or traitors or maybe Belita. However, he dismisses the thought that she could have done so, thinking she would have been the first suspect before, but so far she hasn't shown anything. Anton informs the emperor that he'd received a report that the Grand Duke Kuro left the palace before Emir's disappearance and just returned home with a few of his knights. I thought so, Emir and Kuro, I don't have to be there to figure out the scheme they have plotted. They are not a huge threat, but what worries me the most is my worst headache and the final kingdom remaining before unification. They might attempt to join hands with the kingdom of Uklo, the emperor thinks. At the Empress's palace, she lays awake in bed reflecting on how the emperor had left quietly, unlike she imagined. She turns her head and sees the image of the emperor laying down beside her. However, in a flash it's gone, and she tosses and turns around with the feeling of the bed being empty that night. The next morning, Belita wakes up with red eyes. She goes straight back to bed, explaining that she will sleep until the afternoon appointment with the emperor, so she should wake her up before then. Later, Belita wakes up noticing everywhere dark and questions whether her baby had forgotten to wake her up. She springs up as soon as she notices the emperor beside her. However, he grabs her hand and pulls her back. Sleep until I wake up. She asks when he'd come, and he says around the time of their appointment. Madame Carnal informed him that she wanted him there, so he came, and she was deep asleep. She asks about their horseback riding, and he replies that they can't go in the rain, adding that they go to sleep early since it's been a long day. The emperor falls asleep right away, however. She pushes his hand off and walks to the couch holding a pillow. Later, the emperor wakes up and turns to find the bed empty. He gets up and observes her sleeping on the couch. He questions whether she doesn't like him being there, and thinking she could catch a cold out there, he picks her up, and as he holds her he looks at her and thinks, what if Belita wasn't a lustful empress but an ordinary lady? Could we have lived like my parents? I still cannot forget the way they looked at each other, filled with infinite love, faith and respect. He puts her down and asks what she truly wants by playing an innocent empress. Capturing my heart. I wonder what lies at the end of this. Inexplicable emotion, the emperor thinks. In a new scene, she hurries trying to escape and finally trips. Her chaser, who appears to be the emperor, catches up to her and says, eloping with a foreign prince, I admire your deep love. Don't you agree, Belita? She explains that it was, as she'd mentioned before, she was being chased. However, the emperor calls it nonsense. He asks if she has any more last words as he draws out his sword, and with unsteady breath, she reminds him of his promise not to kill her. However, he pauses before saying he can't recall. She wakes up from this terrible nightmare, and the emperor hurriedly checks on her, asking if she had a nightmare. However, she instinctively slaps his hand off, and after realizing, she apologizes. She asks the emperor why she's there since she was sleeping on the couch, and he explains that he brought her there so she could sleep more comfortably. Was it a bad dream, he asks. However, she doesn't respond and later adds that it's nothing. The next day, Anton asks the emperor if he could proceed as usual regarding the Imperial Street Festival, and he says yes. This annual festival lasts for a week, during which the Empress makes an appearance and inspects the livelihood of the people. So far, Belita simply pretended to take part in the festival and spent passionate nights with noblemen from far away. The emperor reflects on Belita's reaction the previous night and says, I hope she doesn't withdraw from me. In a new scene, Belita sits in the garden while her nanny informs her that they have only a week left to plan everything. Her nanny adds that they have to pay more attention, as she will be attending the street festival on behalf of the emperor. Later, Madame Carnal tells her that as the host she will attend the dinner on the third day, and then she will take a look around the festival. Her nanny adds that they will prepare for the dinner on the third day, and Belita asks if she will be leaving on the third day then. Her nanny asks if there's a problem, adding that she's always done so. However, Belita asks, how about I attend from the first day? With the nightmare last night, I don't really want to face Kalik at the moment. This is perfect timing. For a week I'll see how things go outside the palace. To be more specific, away from Kalik, then I'd be able to clear up this whole situation. Later, she stands in front of the budget and donation for the festival. Her nanny also asks her to sign the budgetary documents, and as she takes a closer look and notices that 50,000 gold coins from the 100,000 budget are set aside for the Empress's personal expenses, she tells her it's too much, explaining that she already has enough dresses, accessories and tiaras that go with them, so there's no need to add more. She tells her she wouldn't need more than 10,000 gold coins instead. One day before the festival, She lays in bed anticipating leaving the palace when the emperor appears asking why she looks so happy. He tells her face says it all, that nothing in the palace makes her happy, but she disputes it and invites him to bed. It's the night before the festival and she not only seems happy but also suggests that I go to bed first. This is not good, he says as he slips his robe from his body. Belita covers her face with the blanket asking why he's suddenly doing that but tells her to come to him. She asks why she would do so, adding that she's not a fool, and just as the emperor is about to respond, he feels a sharp pain. She lifts the blanket to check on him when she spots the scars on his back and hurries to him asking if perhaps the scars are causing trouble. It was all an act as the emperor grabs her hand and pulls her to him saying she's too naive. She asks if he was lying and also mentions the scars, and he replies that they're old and he nearly died. She remarks that it must have hurt and goes to the other side of the bed to grab a jar. As she applies it, she tells him it's an oil that her nanny made and they work like magic. They already started to fade, Belita says. The emperor pulls her close, holding her waist while they share a kiss. Every time, does he actually remember his promise not to take my life? Or was that just temporary? Belita questions. My potential death always sends a chill down my spine, but at the same time, my feelings for him keep growing. What should I do now? In a new scene, the Empress sits in her carriage, and as she takes one last look at the palace before leaving, she reflects on what had happened the previous night. She asked him to stop, adding that she will be sleeping on the couch and not the bed. The Emperor replied that she has to leave the next day, so she should sleep on the bed, and also promised he wouldn't do anything. However, she is to return in 4 days. The festival isn't as expected. Later she stands with raw egg dripping from her head. You wicked Empress! Don't ruin our festival and get out of here, the boy declares. Madame Carnal rushes to check on her while she remains still, overwhelmed by shock. A man decides to punish the boy, however his mother steps in for him. The Empress immediately goes to the night, however that doesn't stop the people from talking. The boy is dead. She has that whip again, the poor boy, how unfortunate that it is the Empress he has to face. Why is she here on the first day? Belita isn't moved. She extends her hand to the boy asking if he is hurt. Sensing the boy still in shock, she suggests his mother take him home and she thanks her before leaving. Later in the tent, she lays down and questions her decision of coming out on the first day. She reflects on how she'd received an invitation to the opening ceremony to extend a simple greeting to dozens of nobles and walk down the main street together where the festival takes place. Unlike the old Belita, I will attend the ceremony and fulfill my duties. People will see me differently if I put on a brighter expression than yesterday. She gets outside and notices a man waving at her and is excited that at least a person's there to welcome her. However, it doesn't take long for this sweet moment to be ruined. People began to react more aggressively, while some were even arrested for making a scene. Later she steps out of her carriage with a feeling of nausea. A man takes her hand and reveals that he will be awaiting her call that night. I hope you have not forgotten me already. She gets a feeling of déjà vu, reflecting on all the men she'd encountered before and their comments. Everyone at the festival looked at her with the same disgusting eyes, and she called herself stupid for thinking she could feel relieved. She ends up throwing up, and later in the tent when her nanny goes to check on her, she sobs. She explains that at first she was happy to stay, attend the festival and stay away from the palace, but not anymore. She feels confused now. I didn't die in the woods like Belita did, but even if it's not Kalik, anyone can kill me if I keep staying with him. Kalik will soon lose the battle, lose his mind and get ruthlessly murdered in the end. I should not be attracted to him, and I still haven't overcome Belita's fate. As if to ridicule me, those disgusting eyes followed me everywhere. Her nanny suggests they go outside and have some fun, and she dresses her up in a way no one recognizes her. They go outside and the Empress gazes at the mirror to get a glimpse of her new look. They explore the different stores open on the street and also get some gifts. Belita discusses laying out a carpet in front to make it comfortable for the people watching the play with her nanny. A man with white hair bumps into her, and as she looks up to thank him for catching her, she feels a sense of familiarity and soon realizes that it's Ethan Stone. She drops to the floor after he leaves, appearing to be in shock. She reflects on how in the original story, the kingdom of Roca invades, and under the tyrannical emperor the nation is left in ruins and the people's resentment grows, and in response, the righteous people, The Jackal Corps rises up and the leader of that group is Ethan Stone. He is the real protagonist of the story, and Kalik, who went wild in the war and became a monster, was killed by him. That man will be the one to take Kalik's life. She goes into the tent, her unexpected encounter with Ethan making it more vivid that Kalik is going to die. I knew it was coming, but I didn't feel it to this extent, she thinks. Memories from the time they'd spent together all flooded in. Their ride in the sunset, and soon tears began pouring down her face. Kalik, don't die, she begs. The next day, and the day after that, she found herself slacking, unable to focus during meetings, with an unceasing heartache. The next day, she goes to the butcher's shop he'd mentioned he would be. As she observes him, noticing that the people around him are the ones who will take Kalik's life. Some guys come to her trying to start a conversation. They try to get her to go play with them, however she remains still, her heart still aching. Suddenly blood pours from a man's hand, and when they notice the man standing in the distance, the other one asks if he's that ugly woman's lover. Calling the greatest beauty of the Kaftan Empire ugly. Do you think you have two lives or something? The Emperor's cold gaze causes them to flee, and when he turns to Belita, he tells her the makeup she has on looks ridiculous. Belita, however, hurries to the Emperor for a hug. Her eyes become teary that the Emperor asks if she really missed him that much, and she nods. He tells her she must have been really excited to be called ugly and asks what happened to her eyes. She asks what about them, however the Emperor just remarks that yes, she is ugly. The Emperor asks if she's still not done there, adding that he told her to be back in 3 days. She tells the Emperor she was going to go back, however he's impatient and asks when exactly. Soaked in dewdrops at dawn. Kalik, I missed you. She pouts and he replies with a smile saying so did he missed her greatly. Later they sit together and she hesitates before asking him if the war with Uklo is really necessary. He asks how she'd found out and she reflects on how it was described in the book. The natural fortress created by the vast desert and the deep canyon made it extremely difficult to conquer. It was the last kingdom for Kaftan to end the 4-year war and unite the continent and to put an end to his mission. He invades the kingdom with 1 million troops only to be defeated miserably, and with his military significantly weakened. He suffers from an attack from Roka and Ethan, and that's how he dies. Can you not do it? Maybe you can rule this empire without Uklo. However, the Emperor declares sharply, Belita, nothing you say will stop the unification. It is my duty. She reflects on how previously she would have asked to stay in Felon for a while for protection, however now she has a new goal, to prevent his death. The Emperor asks if she was hurt earlier, and she replies no, adding that he had arrived just in time. He then suggests returning to the palace, but she tells him she will return the next morning as she has something to do and someone to meet. I hope that someone is not a man. The Emperor asks and she shakes her head saying it's not like that and he should trust her. Then make me trust you, the Emperor responds. She lifts her head and kisses him, and when she stops the Emperor leaves her a last message. Come back early, I will be waiting for you, before taking his leave. After he leaves, she wakes herself up reflecting on how she hadn't tried to change the original storyline because she'd thought she didn't have the power to do so. However now, being alive means there's a chance, so she will change the story. Later at night, Belita goes to Ethan and asks that they speak in private for a while. However, he hesitates at first saying he's busy, but later gives in after learning it's something important. Listen carefully, Ethan. Take this and come find me later in the palace in a few days. She hands the accessory to him and whispers into his ear. I know about the jackals. His eyes widens and he immediately makes a stance of defense. However, she tells him she wouldn't do that if she were him since she has no intentions of threatening him. He demands to know who she is. However, she tells him if he wishes to find out he should visit the palace. Do as I say, it is the only way to save the jackals yourself and this empire. The next day at the palace, she has a meal with the Emperor and he asks if she's finished with her business. She says yes and thinks, I don't know when Ethan will come to the palace with the bracelet, but given how much the jackals mean to him, he will come for sure. The Emperor notices her look and asks if she's tired, but she says maybe she just woke up too early. Concerned about her health, the Emperor asks if she will be skipping the horseback riding that day, but she says no and suggests that he join her also. Later, she bonds with the horse and the Emperor tells her she looks happy and asks if it isn't about time she gave the horse a name. After a second of deliberating, she decides on Nellie because it's similar to her name. He tells her it sounds like a name she would choose and suggests they ride on the horses for a while before it gets late. After a while of galloping, the emperor expresses how he hasn't galloped like that in a while and he feels hot and as a result pulls his shirt up. The emperor gets off his horse suggesting they wrap up and then goes to help her off her horse however. Feeling the comfort in his arms, she hugs him. Belita, you are. He leans closer revealing she has the gift for driving people to madness. They both kiss for a while and only until he pushes her onto the ground does he realize the kiss will no longer be enough. This isn't enough. Will you come to me tonight? Tell me in your own voice, the emperor asks and she replies that she will be there before kissing him. Later she goes into her palace and after a while of hesitation, she asks Madame Carnal if she will help her get ready for consummation. Later at night, she arrives at the basement of the emperor's palace, a place she's never been to before. As she descends, she reflects on how she'd heard there is a hot spring only emperors are allowed to use. When she finally descends, the maids direct her to the emperor who sits comfortably in the hot spring. The emperor looks at her as if observing every inch of her before declaring, "Come on in, Belita." She takes off her clothes and steps into the hot tub, and even with the emperor asking to know why she's so far away she buries her head in her palm. She asks him to give her some time explaining that she has no idea what to say and the heat is driving her crazy. You are the first person to come here at my invitation. Which means no one has come yet. That is why I'm rather nervous. I mean, you are the first. He slowly reaches for her hand saying they aren't taking things quickly at all and rather it took a painfully long time for them to come that far. Kalik, I feel better now, she reveals. As the emperor leans in closer he declares, tomorrow morning, we shall have become truly weds. For years ago, she screamed in terror, questioning how he could slay people on their wedding night. The emperor's response was cold as usual as he asked whether rather he was to forgive the rats who had been leaking information just because it is their wedding night. Sensing no remorse from the emperor she trembled, unable to grasp that she had now been wed to the war maniac. She declared that she can't and as the princess of Felon she wouldn't spend the night with a man who had just bathed in blood. We will put it off until you're completed with the rest of the battles. However, the emperor's gaze was cold as he remarked that it no longer mattered now. Turning away from her on their wedding night thinking, he doesn't care since he never was interested in her anyway. Leaving behind Belita, the emperor continued to the kingdom of Sonic to continue his obsession with unification and a year later when he returned, the palace was filled with all sorts of rumors of the Empress inviting yet another man into her chambers. Despite hearing all sorts of vulgar rumors about her, he showed no regard. Meanwhile, he successfully occupied all kingdoms except Uklo. 3 years later, he came back to the maids gossiping about the new man the Empress was seeing who appeared to be the second prince of Roca and later, Anton rushed to his office with news that the Empress had eloped with the prince. He was aware her beauty captivated all men but he didn't expect it to be such a nuisance, so he arose declaring that the Princess of Felon has lost her value thinking he shall go see her shameless face one last time. He went there to kill her, however her expression made him question whether she was always capable of smiling that way. In the present time, the Emperor pushes Belita onto the bed declaring, "Belita, we are married. Are you my wife?" "Yes, Kalik, as your wife. I trust you and I love you." Later, they lay in bed with the Emperor checking on Belita, asking to know if it hurts. Sensing his worry, she confesses that he was too rough and he apologizes, but as he's about to speak she interrupts saying, "It was fine. You were rough and gentle at the same time." She reflects on how the Emperor had gone into the hot spring afterwards and she can't stay awake now. "Fine, it gives me every reason to keep you awake," the Emperor declares. "Did you think that you would be able to sleep peacefully when you came to my chamber with your own 2 feet? The Emperor asks. "Be ready, you will not be sleeping tonight," he finishes. Thank you so much guys for watching. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and also don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments and leave a comment for part 2. Have a good day.